Hey guys, and thanks for watching. Today we're going to talk about carburetors on a two-stroke machine, whether it's a chainsaw, blower, trimmer. We're going to go through it. We're going to figure out what kind of problems can happen, whether you have a problem with yours, the parts, function, pieces, and everything. And I'm going to show you what I do as a steel gold tech here in the shop. Let's get to it. All right guys, so here we are. We have all of our carb examples. And before we get started, we're going to talk about some tools that you may need. The number one tool that you will need is a pressure tester and vacuum tester. So pressure, vacuum, a hose, and this is an adapter. So we're going to be testing your pump diaphragm, metering diaphragm, making sure the carb's airtight. Another thing you may need, a golf tee to plug off fuel lines so they don't leak everywhere. A nice little hook for pulling out, or a pick for pulling out the fuel screens, a brush for cleaning the outside of the carb off, and then we may need a pair of pliers. Non-flammable brake clean, non-flammable. This is a big, very important part in this. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. And a squirt bottle with some soapy water. And last but not least, not a necessary must, but a JIS screwdriver. So difference between your JIS and a regular one. So this is just your standard size 2 Phillips. See how it kind of fits in there. There's some slop. Take your JIS, and there you go. Japanese industrial standard, I think, is what that stands for. Anyways, so you're here watching this because you have a issue with your carb, or maybe you just want to learn. But to do that, we have to break these down into two different sections of carbs. So first one is a purge primer. So you'll find these on trimmers, blowers, with the primer attached to the carb here on trimmers and blowers, maybe hedge trimmers and stuff like that. You won't find them with the primer attached to it on chainsaws. And your other one is a non-purge carburetor. So this is off of a, I can't remember, probably a 360 chainsaw MS steel. And all right, so you got your purge and your non-purge. So some of the differences here, obviously your purge primer, that's for easier starting. You'll push this to prime the system. It'll suck fuel through here. There's your your recirc. After the carb is full with fuel, it'll start pushing it down here and back into the tank, where your non-purge carb here requires some pooling to get the system primed from the impulse there. So we talked about some of your differences between these two, where you'll find them and everything. Next thing we need to do is talk about the parts that are on them. So you got your purge and your recirc. This is your fuel in, and that is your impulse line that powers your fuel pump. Not all of them are going to have this. This is off of a FS91 trimmer here. Most of them are going to look like that. You're going to have a hole right here that powers your fuel pump from the crankcase, and essentially your piston cylinder is going up and down, and that creates pressure and vacuum, pressure and vacuum. And what that is doing is flexing this pump diaphragm up and down, up and down, up and down. And that is also generated in here, the up and down motion, which powers your fuel pump, which sucks fuel up through here. Anyways, so with your non-purge carb here, you'll notice you have your mixture screws. Some of them are marked like this H for high speed. The low, you can barely see it right there, it's the low speed. This is on every single carb. Your low speed is always going to be toward your engine, and your high speed here is always going to be on the air filter side. You can also designate that by your throttle butterfly is going to be on the engine side, and your choke butterfly is going to be on the air filter side. So that's always going to happen. And really, your low speed, you can see those little holes in there. We call those your idle progression ports. So while your engine is idling, fuel is coming out of those ports. And as soon as you blip the throttle, then your high speed back here that's sticking down, it's brass, that'll open up from pressure differences and add more fuel into the airstream. So what we need to do first, we need to perform a pressure test. So we're going to start with a purge primer. You can do, I think, 4 or 5 different tests with these. And this is what I do here in the shop. So we take our pressure tester, make sure it's in pressure mode. Then we're going to hook it to our fuel inlet. So with it hooked up to the carb, we are going to pump it up to about 7.5 psi. What we want to do here is watch this needle, make sure it does not drop down. And if that does hold, that's fine and dandy. So what we can do now, while you still have pressure, you can take your carb and push the primer bulb, and that needle should leak down. Okay, if it passes that step, now we're going to put it in vacuum mode. With it still hooked up, now we're going to push the primer bulb, and it should hold in a negative and not drop back to 0 more than 1 second. And this one does. Now we can take it off of our fuel inlet and put it on our recirc here. And what we're doing here, make sure your gauge is in pressure mode. Now we're going to pump the bulb. And it should pump up and hold the pressure. So this carb is airtight. Everything is functioning. The check valves in your purge primer are functioning the way they should. There's no holes in any diaphragms, not leaking through the high speed or low speed or anything like that. Also should be noted, when you're doing these pressure tests here, put it back on the fuel inlet. When you guys pressure test up to 7.5 psi, you're essentially putting pressure through here on your pump side all the way up, or I'm sorry, pump side up to your inlet needle, and your inlet needle is holding all the pressure this way. Now if it leaked through here, more than likely it's going to leak through your high speed nozzle there, and that's a pretty common way for some bad things to happen. Might be hard to start and everything like that. So okay, now after we pressure test our purge primer, if you have a non-purge carb, this one's very, very simple. All you would do is hook up the line just like we did with our purge. Put that pressure tester in pressure mode. Now this one does leak, I've tested it, and we're gonna show you how to test if you do have a leak in your system here. So we're gonna pump it up. And watch it slowly, slowly, slowly drop down. Okay, so if your carb is leaking, this is where the soapy water comes in play. So we're gonna squirt this guy right here. See the little bubbles? We are leaking on our purge, or our primer, on our pump side diaphragm. So a lot of times that can be remedied through a overhaul kit or rebuild kit, but you know, most of the time the gaskets, you just have a little debris on there. And when you tear these apart, sometimes if you don't get the mating services and you put it all back together, also another note, if you do tear these apart and put them back together, make sure you do a pressure test just to make sure that you're not introducing an air leak into the system. All right, so it should be noted also that some of these carbs have what we call a accelerator pump. Now the accelerator pump, every single time that your trigger is blipped or your throttle is blipped, it adds a tiny amount of fuel into the fuel stream for a crisp, clean acceleration. So how do you know if you have an accelerator pump? Pretty simple. On your impulse side, where your throttle butterfly is, if you have a brass plug here, some of them are stainless, some of them don't have them at all, this is equipped with a accelerator pump. This is not equipped with a accelerator pump. It'll always be in line with your throttle shaft here. So if you don't have any holes or brass plugs, see if this guy, this is BG50, throttle side does not. So anyways, we are going to tear into a carb here. So this is your non-purge, and we are going to begin with our pump side. So we can take our JIS screwdriver, all right, so here we have our diaphragm, and in our gasket. Your diaphragm is always going to be facing your pump side. It has to be flush with your mating surface. And then your gasket here is to ensure that the pump diaphragm can move up and down and up and down. If you're not used to tearing these apart, just make sure that you remember how they go back together. If not, you can look up a parts lookup. So just make sure you're putting them all back together correctly. So this is our pump side, and we will notice that this is your fuel inlet here. So fuel is going to come through here, over to this chamber, down through this chamber. This is your pumping chamber. Then over through here and into your fuel inlet screen here. A lot of times, say your unit will idle, and anytime you try to blip it to give it some throttle, it bogs down, it's starving for fuel. A lot of times your fuel screen here is blocked up. This one you can see it's got a little bit of junk on it, and we should clean that or replace it. So here is a very good example of one that is completely blocked. This one started and idled perfectly fine, but died instantly when you tried to give it some fuel. And that's all due from either a hole in your line, a dirty or restricted fuel filter running without a filter at all. So this one here, you can probably guess what the fuel filter is sitting over there for. It doesn't look dirty, but it is coated with a white substance or material. And that came from this fuel filter. So this fuel filter is just coated, eventually made its way through up into the fuel system. So this fuel screen here is actually from the same exact unit. You can replace those. Most of the time they come into a parts rebuild kit for your carb. You can try to clean them. You can hold them with pliers and hit them with some non-flammable brake clean, but sometimes it's just better to replace them. So anyways, this is our pump side. So this is the last section on the pump side where the fuel is before it is over here. So this is our metering side, and your metering side is also going up and down, just like your pump diaphragm, with your pressure and vacuum from the piston. So this reservoir here is always going to give you a low pressure supply of fuel to the carb at all times, anytime that the piston is moving up and down when the engine is running. So we're going to remove our screws holding the metering side. And before I open this up, I do want to show you an example of what rotten, stale fuel looks like. So this is a carb. It's an old Talotzen. Typically you find these on cutoff machines. There was water in this system, and just look at that. Fuel screen is rusty, black varnish. You open this up and see your carb like this, don't even bother cleaning it. Throw it away. Go get a new carb, because you're going to waste a lot of time and effort into this trying to clean it, make it right, and it's just going to drive you nuts trying to fix it. Before we get over to our metering side, this is another example. I just had this unit in, and I couldn't get any fuel to come into the system. It was, driving me nuts, checking for impulse and everything, so I figured I'd tear the carb down, and that is the fuel screen, and this is the fuel that was actually in the unit. Here, we'll see if we can see the separation. See all that nasty stuff in the bottom? That, not sure what it was, it tested negative for water, but it has somehow formed a corrosive material or a corrosive compound inside of this, and over here on our metering side started etching out the Welsh plugs, and it started eating them away. So this carb is pretty much shot, and we will be installing a new carb. So back to your metering side, we just took our cover off. Here's your metering diaphragm. Before we even look at the metering side, check and make sure that your metering diaphragm can move up and down. It's soft and pliable. You don't have any rips or tears, which we would have found in the pressure test. This one's a little iffy because it's indented here, and I'll show you one that is bad. Click, 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 click. That one is not soft and pliable. So we would be replacing that. Anyways, your metering side here. So our metering side diaphragm here, or metering side of the carb, as soon as you take your metering side diaphragm off, you should inspect what your metering side should look like. Is nice and clean, but there's one problem with this right here. Your fuel inlet, or your needle and your inlet needle hold down screw right here should be bright and shiny, just like this tool. If it is dulled like that is, throw the carb away. It has had some sort of contaminated fuel inside, and there's only a few things that would cause your inlet screw to be dulled like that. Here's an example of a brand new carb. See how bright and shiny the inlet needle hold down screw is. Also, on Walbro carburetors, they do not use sealant that goes around your Welsh plugs, your part loads, or your fixed jets or anything like that. Anything Zama newer than 2010 should have your red cured sealant around there that protects from ethanol fuel. Before 2008, there was no ethanol in the fuel, and once it started showing up, it started eating away all of the sealant. Here's one. I opened up this carb, and you can literally see the sealant that went around the Welsh plugs here. It's just brittle. It's broken off. You're never going to be able to seal it up, so if you open up your carb and find this, just throw it away, get a new carb, and be done with it. So anyways, you want to make sure this is all clean. Like I said, if you see that, throw the carb away. You may try to salvage it just because the screw is, you know, dulled, and you could try to clean it and put it back together. But anyways, these are all your part load jets, part load, low or your high speed fuel feed, your fixed jet here. Every single carb is different, so don't freak out if your carb looks like this. Let me see, metering side. I think we already went through that. Yeah, that was your sealant. Anyways, just make sure your carb doesn't look terrible on the inside. Make sure it's nice and clean. But so we're gonna jump over to cleaning now, and there's only two ways to clean a carburetor that is a purge primer carb. They are very sensitive. All the O-rings, the tiny little O-rings, if yours is equipped with an accelerator pump, and the diaphragms themselves are sensitive to hazardous or corrosive materials such as like carburetor cleaner. Don't ever dunk your carb in a jug of carb clean. Don't use the spray that's carb clean. Don't use anything flammable. I see this, a lot of guys use air compressors. Do not ever touch your carb with an air compressor. If you stick your air compressor in this hole and blow it out, if you haven't, or you have done this in the past and you gotten lucky, maybe you might be lucky enough not to blow your pump diaphragm or your metering diaphragm, but if you get enough pressure in there, you will blow the high-speed check valve right out of there. And it's just a little tiny disc, and it'll just shoot out of there, and then you're going to be flooding your machine thinking, man, what the heck is going on? So anyways, I'm going to put this carb back together, and we are going to show you how to clean a carb correctly. You should always start your screws by hand or with your fingers. If need be, you can put them on with a screwdriver and go reverse until you feel the threads drop in. And these don't have to be crazy tight, just hand tight is fine. All right, there's our metering side and our pump side. Should also, I kind of skipped this on accident. Your pump side diaphragm here, make sure it's not swelled and worn in. If it's swelled and it's retaining its memory or shape, you should probably get a rebuild kit for it. It's not going to be doing its job efficiently, and got that on backwards. All right, almost finished here. Okay, so we want to clean our carburetor. You want to do it right, we can remove our low speed and high speed. Let me get a smaller screwdriver here. All right, so let's take out the high speed first. Just keep in mind your high speed and low speed mixture screws are sometimes exactly the same or sometimes different. Usually your high speed is a little bit longer. Sometimes there's an O-ring on them. Just be careful and make sure you remember which is which. So high speed is over here. Now time for our low speed. And here's our low speed. You can see our low speed is just a little bit longer, so low speed right there. So this is where our non-flammable brake clean comes into play. Like I said, if you do use one that says flammable, you'll eventually start wearing out your diaphragms and your O-rings and stuff like that. The stuff's like $3. It's well worth it. So we are going to start with our low speed, and when we go to clean this here, we're going to open up our throttle, and these holes right there are our idle screws, or our idle holes where the fuel's coming out at idle into the venturi and into the engine. So to clean these, we're going to take our little nozzle. We're going to stick it into, if I can do this with a camera. All right. You should also wear safety glasses when you're doing this because fuel is going to go shooting out of that hole. See how it's coming out of the idle progression holes? Now our low speed circuit's flushed. Now we can move over to our high speed. And we're just going to put our nozzle down in there. And there you go. And now we will put our low speed back in, our high speed back in, and put our screws. Install them. If you don't know what the carb is set at, make sure you run your screws all the way down and count how many turns you have them on each ran down. Each carburetor is specific on how many turns out. Most steel is 1 and 1, but now everything's changing. Like your 4-mix engines, most of those are 3.5 on the high and like 1 1/4 or something on the low. So we just flush out all the passageways, and that is the only way to clean this carburetor. You can also try to put it into a ionizer tank or a sonic tank, some people say. I do that if I'm doing a rebuild on a carb. I'll tear it all the way down, throw it in the tank for a half hour, come back and rebuild it with a new parts kit here. But you don't want to use any harmful stuff on your carb here that will possibly eat it away or cause you some problems later on. So this is my first video, and I've kind of been wanting to do this for a while because there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, and if you watch those on YouTube, it drove me nuts. There's so much incorrect stuff on there, guys doing things wrong, and I'd hate to see you guys do that too. So here we're making a video. I know I missed a lot of stuff and I wasn't very explanatory, but I am going to be making more videos, probably a how to tune your unit. So I'm gonna probably do a video on my 261 up there, and yeah, so if you like this video and you want to see more, or if you have questions or comments, give me a like, subscribe, because I'm going to be doing a boatload of more videos when I get some free time. So stay tuned, and hope you guys enjoy.